Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you all, and welcome to Removing Barriers, a History of the Cook County Just Housing Amendment. My name is Jennifer King. I am the Director for Cook County's Department of Human Rights and Ethics, which includes our Commission on Human Rights, which is hosting this event today. Thank you all so much for joining us. I do want to note that this discussion happens during a notable month. This is Fair Housing Month, Second Chance Month, and as well as the 6th anniversary, or close to the 6th anniversary of the passage of the Just Housing Amendment. Happy to have you here, hoping that this conversation will celebrate two things: the collaboration between our community partners and county governmental leaders, as well as the effective protection of the Just Housing Amendment in ensuring fair access to housing for all. Before we begin, I want to make two notes. So there are note cards at your table. You can include questions that you may have for our panelists at the end of the discussion. Staff will come around and collect those at some point. And also, I'd like to introduce our chair of the Cook County Commission, Chair Sufyan Sohail, to give opening remarks.
Thank you, Director King. My name is Sufyan Sohail, and I have the honor of serving as chair of the Cook County Commission on Human Rights. The commission is made up of 11 county residents appointed by President Tony Preckwinkle, and together we work to uphold and enforce the county's anti-discrimination and harassment laws, which include the Human Rights Ordinance, the Paid Leave Ordinance, and the Minimum and Living Wage Ordinance. Beyond enforcement, we also engage in community outreach to strengthen our investigations and inform meaningful policy rooted in dignity and equity. It's estimated that nearly 1.4 million people across Cook County have an arrest or conviction record, many of whom face unfair barriers to housing because of that history. Our commitment to a just and compassionate reentry process fuels the Commission's work. We want every resident, regardless of their past, to know that they have a right to safe, stable, and accessible housing. That's not just policy, that's a promise. Since 2019, our staff has worked with urgency and care to investigate alleged violations of the Just Housing Amendment, or JHA. We've also embraced creative approaches to outreach, finding new ways to educate housing providers about the responsibility under the law. With partnership from the Cook County Assessor's Office, we now include information about the JHA directly on property tax assessments. And with collaboration from TransUnion, we help ensure their Smart Move screening tool is now aligned with the JHA's requirements. These are meaningful wins, and we are grateful for the partnerships that make them possible. And yet, for every resident who knows their rights under the Just Housing Amendment, we know many more continue to face barriers rooted in their background, and that's why our outreach continues to evolve. Right now, we're updating our Fair Housing Video Library to provide accessible tools for people directly impacted by housing discrimination. We're also working with Roosevelt University to examine and strengthen our enforcement efforts since the JHA was passed. By joining today's discussion, you are recognizing the importance of this work and standing with us in the fight for fair, inclusive housing across the county. Thank you again for being here today. We hope you'll leave this conversation not only informed, but inspired. And if something resonates with you, we encourage you to share it with your networks. And most importantly, if you or someone you know has experienced housing discrimination, please reach out to the Commission on Human Rights. We are here, we are listening, and we are ready to act. I'm now so pleased to introduce you to Cook County Commissioner from the 16th District, Commissioner Frank Aguilar.
Thank you very much, and Madam President, and all here. I support this legislation. This there's still discrimination out there, and in 2025, and I had a experience that I remember. I'm a biker by profession, and one situation was a few years ago. He was, bikers don't look very friendly. They're very tough looking. They got a reputation, but one of them was out looking for an apartment, and he did his time, he paid his price, and he had a very, very hard time looking for a place to live. And he reached out to me. He had maybe a few years ago, and for that reason, until the landlord found out that this this gentleman was a pastor of a church. You know, he turned his whole life around. Then he changed his tone. So that just tells you that there's still attitudes out there. There's still judgment. There's still discrimination. And you know, my office informed the landlord. It goes, basically, you're breaking the law. You know, this gentleman here qualified for housing. He had a job. He turned his life around, and he has give him a fair chance of housing. So it's still out there. And that's why I really support this legislation, because it really calls to justice, and people who pay their price, they turn their life around. I've seen it. I've seen it time and time again. People turn their lives around and go towards a direction, and then themselves reach out to other individuals that have a hard life and help them turn their life. So, and it's unfortunate that they get discriminated against because of their past. And this legislation will confront this, and I'm glad to see it, and I support this over. And again, the leadership, our board president, Tony Preckwinkle, and support my colleagues on it. So thank you very much for doing this. And Madam President, I guess who's up? Who's next?
Jennifer's coming.
Oh, Jennifer, she's going. So Jennifer, it's up to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chair Sohel and Commissioner Aguilar, for your very important and thoughtful remarks. I do want to jump into introduction of our panelist so that we can start our conversation. First, starting with President Tony Preckwinkle of the Cook County Board of Commissioners. Tony Preckwinkle is the 35th president of the Cook County Board, an office she has held since 2010. She's the first Black woman to be elected to this office. A dedicated and effective public servant, President Preckwinkle has worked to transform county government through increased fiscal responsibility, transparency, and improved services. President Preckwinkle has remained committed to reimagining our criminal justice system and taking an approach that also addresses mental health issues, substance abuse, and addiction as illnesses to be treated, not crimes to be punished. President Preckwinkle has worked collaboratively with the county's public safety stakeholders towards the goals of safely reducing the population of Cook County Jail and Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center while preserving public safety, reducing recidivism, and promoting fair and equitable access to justice. Thank you so much. Please join me in welcoming President Preckwinkle. Thank you. Next, I will introduce Amadou Dramé. He's the director of the Illinois Justice Project. Throughout his career, Amadou has increased awareness about the injustices of the criminal legal system, empowered people in communities impacted by mass incarceration and homelessness, and advocated to reduce society's reliance on the criminal legal system as a response to racial, economic, and social inequities. Amadou previously served as the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Safer Foundation, where he played a significant role in advancing the passage of the Just Housing Amendment. He was a member of the coalition that advocated for its passage. He helped develop and execute the coalition's strategy and served as a media spokesperson. Today, his team at the Illinois Justice Project continues to support implementation of the Just Housing Amendment. Please join me in welcoming Amadou Dramé. And last but certainly not least, Maria Moon is the Senior Housing Justice Organizer at the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance. Maria previously served as a community organizer with the Cabrini Green Legal Aid and a facilitator of Visible Voices, a peer support group for formerly incarcerated women. Maria was a key figure in the fight to pass the Just Housing Amendment by sharing her own story, organizing other impacted individuals, and compelling elected officials and other key stakeholders to support this very important change in the law. As Senior Housing Justice Organizer, she provides education on the JHA, also known as Just Housing Amendment, and other related laws across Cook County and Illinois, connecting individuals to legal assistance, housing resources, and reentry services. Join me in welcoming Maria Moon. Perfect. So let's get into the discussion that everyone came here for. Of course, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. I do want to start with Madam President. What was the we're thinking about the motivation for passing the Just Housing Amendment. What were the initial discussions regarding drafting this protection?
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank Jennifer King and her team for their good work, our commissioner for the good work of that body as well. And I want to thank Commissioner Aguilar for joining us and for his interest in the subject matter. Thank you, Commissioner. So I'm a history teacher, and when I talk about incarceration in this country, I remind folks that we're 5% of the world's population, and we have 25% of the people in the world who are in jail or prison. So what I usually say is, unless you think Americans are more likely to be criminals than people elsewhere in the world, we're doing something terribly wrong. Terribly wrong. And of course, our incarceration rates for people of color, particularly African Americans, are astronomical. We incarcerate white people at about the same rates they do in, like, Europe. But the reason our prison population, our jail population is so astronomical is we detain and imprison people of color at just extraordinary rates. And that's a reflection, of course, of endemic racism in this country. It gets played out in lots of different arenas in different ways. In our criminal justice system, it gets played out in the arrest, the detention, the imprisonment disproportionately of people from communities of color. I want to acknowledge the mayor of the city of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, because I think he was the sponsor of the Just Housing ordinance when we passed it 6 years ago. And I want to thank all the advocates who worked so hard to gather support among our fellow commissioners. As I recall, it was not a unanimous vote. And we are grateful to all the work done by advocates to help persuade our commissioners that this was the thing we ought to do. You know, when you come out of prison, they give you some nominal amount of money and sometimes just drop you off in the middle of the night somewhere. If we don't provide housing for people, we increase the likelihood that they'll go back into the prison system, you know. And holding somebody in jail is extraordinarily expensive. The last time I checked, and don't hold me to this, it was like $46,000 a year or something to keep somebody in jail. And of course, it costs a tremendous amount for homeless services as well. So if we can just stabilize people's housing situation, provide them with housing stability, we can go a long way toward ensuring that they don't return to our prison system, to our penal system. So again, I want to thank all of the advocates, all of Jennifer and her team for all their good work, and to former Commissioner Brandon Johnson for his willingness to step up and take this on early in his first term.
Perfect. Thank you, Madam President. And Amadou and Maria, as advocates, you know, President Preckwinkle shared a lot about the motivation for passing this important protection. As advocates, what conversations were you having, and how did you go about coalition building to build the initiative for passage of the ordinance amendment?
So I would say that our primary strategy, which was the heart and the spirit of the ordinance, was to center people like myself that actually had arrest or conviction records, and that we led at that table, which is not how it necessarily is. It's not the usual all the time. But we actually led, and our voices were more than heard but respected at that table. And this is our ordinance, you know, and we were listened to. The narrative, we carried the narrative. We directed the narrative, and that's what it was about. And we mobilized our own other people with arrest and conviction records that had the lived experience. So I would say, and Amadou could add to that, that was the primary strategy and the spirit and the heart of the ordinance and the work that we did.
Yeah, I wouldn't add much to that. I think Maria got the essence of it. The only thing I would add is that in addition to organizing and mobilizing, I think there was widespread recognition that many of the housing options that exist for anybody who doesn't have a record but who falls into a space of, you know, experiencing housing instability, what have you, were basically doors locked to folks with records. And you know, without without spending too much time getting into weeds, I think we wanted to make sure that we, at a minimum, were able to begin by addressing housing discrimination that took place in what is housing for most people, which is the private housing market. And so definitely kudos to many people who were involved in the advocacy and organizing work. I was actually a latecomer to the coalition. I think the work had been underway for about 2 or 3 years up until that point. But as Maria stated, was a very strong foundation, and really the work was centered around people with lived experience and their experiences in the system and with housing discrimination.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And let's shift to the process of actually drafting this ordinance amendment. You know, can someone walk us through this? We know that this is the first protection of its kind in a county. Were there other models to look at?
Yeah, so we were fortunate, and I'm happy to take a first crack at this, but we were fortunate in our coalition to have many people with lived experience, of course, but also other policy advocates who had worked on these types of ordinances across the country. The Shriver Center, for example, used to have a few staffers, Kate Walsh, who's now with Uptown People's Law Center, as well as Marie Claire Tran-Leung, who's, I think, with the National Housing Law Project now. But at the time, she was really the author of about 2 or 3 fair chance housing ordinances across the country. Not quite as strong as the protections that we had in Cook County. I think we benefited from seeing other things there, and we're able to really punch a ticket really strong here. But there were protections out in Seattle. I think we took a look at some of those, wanted to make some tweaks, and then of course there's always the local circumstances and dynamics as well that we had to account for. But you know, that was certainly happening. And of course there were conversations happening with the real estate industry as well as government stakeholders too, to really figure out where we could land and what would be feasible.
And were there any key reports or data used to help develop the language? You noted that you looked at Seattle as a model and some of the other ordinances that have been passed previously. Data, and how did that play into this?
Well, fortunately for us, Roosevelt University and at the time what was called Business and Professional People in the Public Interest, which is now called Impact for Equity, had just completed a study called No Place to Call Home, Navigating Reentry Housing in Chicago. It's always helpful if you have, not only with people experience who are have been justice involved, but also kind of academic validation of the path forward. And this study provided that for us. The principal policy recommendation was, quote, treat persons with criminal records as a protected class, unquote. So basically, we would try to be sure that individuals with arrest records or conviction records weren't just banned from the private housing market. We wanted to make that illegal.
Perfect. That is certainly, I never thought of it that way, as treating them as a protected class. That's certainly what the JHA has accomplished.
We can thank Roosevelt University and Impact for Equity for that.
Yeah. And, you know, the Just Housing Amendment has a screening process which allows landlords to run a background check after a person's application has been pre-approved. So there's a 2-step process where an individual meets pre-qualification criteria, like credit, income, and then there's a second step where then they can run the background check, the criminal background check. And it's limited to only looking at criminal history within the past 3 years. We refer to this as the 3-year look-back period. We get a lot of questions about how this came about. How is it determined that it would be limited to 3 years? Can you give us some insight into how this was chosen, maybe from some of the data or the models that were used in drafting the language of the ordinance?
Sure. Again, this is research that supports the legislation. So basically, if you make it through 3 years, you're less likely to offend again. So that was the break point that we decided we would use, and then, you know, basically landlords have the opportunity to consider folks who maybe have had some minor infraction in the last 3 years, but basically 3 years was the bar for us because of the research that showed that if an individual, as I said, made it through 3 years without further interaction with the law, they were likely to not reoffend.
But it wasn't that easy. It looks easy after a policy is passed.
Retrospectively.
Right, exactly. But it wasn't. We were in those rooms, we were going at it. Like, trying to just negotiate, like, no, not 10 years, no, 7 years. That's why it's important to have directly affected people that's actually going through it. Because I was actually homeless or living out of my car during the time. And so it was more of a hunger and desperation, like, look, we can't wait that long, like, so.
Yeah.
And Amadou could definitely speak to the drama that
Maria's chuckling because we had some very spirited conversations along the way internally with the coalition. But we, it was the democratic process in action, right? And we're not the only stakeholder who has thoughts and opinions about how fair housing ought to look like and what the process ought to look like for people with records in terms of being able to obtain housing access. And I'd say we had some very spirited conversations internally as well as with the real estate industry. And Madam President is correct about where the research lands. It was also the case that we're dealing with some stakeholders who wanted a much longer look back period. But I think with the leadership that we had at the county, we were able to stand pretty firm on the research and the principles and let the data kind of speak for itself. So very grateful for that.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to diminish the work that it took to get us to that point. But having academic research that gives you some credibility in the arguments you make is always helpful.
Yep.
Yes.
Perfect. This sounds to me like it's a great example of community leaders and our county leaders really working together in collaboration to reach a point that's a benefit for the Cook County residents. Madam President, before Cook County, no other county had a law like this. We know that there were other models which were used in drafting this. But were there any concerns or considerations about being the first county to have this protection in the country?
Now, the first few years in this job, I got elected in 2010. And for the first 3 years, I spent trying to get the finances stabilized because, first of all, your first obligation as an executive is to manage your budget. And we had some real challenges in that regard. The first year we had a $487 million budget gap to close. The next year was like 382 or something. We spent the first 3 or 4 years trying to get the finances in order, both because that's your primary obligation and because what I said to my staff was, we can't pursue any of our policy objectives unless we do this, because otherwise they'll just throw back at us, you haven't managed the finances, why are you talking to us about anything else, right? So about 2013, we got the stakeholders together in the criminal justice system. So that's the chief judge, the sheriff, the state's attorney, the public defender, the clerk of the court. And we pushed for it out of my office. I have to credit Kim Fox and Lynetta Haynes-Turner, who's now my chief of staff, for their good work at the Justice Advisory Council over a number of years there. But we started out with having stabilized the finances. We started out with our criminal justice reform work. That's the point I wanted to get to. So in 2013, we started our criminal justice reform work. And of course, all of this is related to the just housing ordinance, right? You work on mitigating the demonization of people who get justice involved, right? So, with the stakeholders in the criminal justice arena, we worked on a number of things together, including trying to reduce the jail population, because we had large numbers of people in our jail who were there because they couldn't pay even nominal bonds. So you could be accused of shoplifting and get a $1,000 bond. You got to pay 10%. That's $100, and you didn't have it yourself, or family members have it. So you sat in jail and waited to your trial. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? Anyway, so we worked on criminal justice reform issues, and because of the work we did, in 2017, the chief judge issued an order to the judges in criminal court saying that the default should be liberty and not detention. So we reduced dramatically our reliance on cash bonds and saw a dramatic drop in the jail population. So what I was suggesting is there was a lot of work that was done around criminal justice reform before we got to just housing. And then, of course, I think it was in 2021, is that right? The state legislature passed the Pretrial Fairness Act. Somebody should check that for me. It's 2021 or 2022. And then, of course, some of the more conservative state's attorneys in the state sued to try to prevent the implementation of the law. The Supreme Court finally decided that it was constitutional. And so in the fall of 2023, the Pretrial Fairness Act was instituted and cash bond was eliminated in the state of Illinois. So, and I would argue that a lot of work that we did to kind of plow the ground around criminal justice reform impacted the state legislation that emerged in 2021, 2022, which eliminated cash bond entirely, for which, you know, we should all be very proud. We live in a state in which, you know, liberty is not dependent on the size of your wallet. You know, this is a good thing. So I guess the point I'm making is we have been working on criminal justice reform since 2013. And so we're trying to reduce the jail population. We're trying to reduce racial disparities. We haven't had much luck on that, I'll tell you. Had a lot of luck in reducing the jail population, but not on the racial disparities of who's actually in the jail. And then we got to the point, you know, what happens when people get out of detention or incarceration? And what makes sense, of course, is trying to be sure that they have access to the housing market. Long answer to a short question.
No, that was very helpful. I will note, I double-checked, it was January of '21 when the Illinois Pretrial Fairness Act was passed. So you were correct, Madam President.
Occasionally, I remember things.
I think it's great to have that context, that the Just Housing Amendment is a part of a larger initiative to reform the criminal justice system and provide more equity, and looking at this as a larger issue. It's not just in terms of our prison system or jail system, but also in terms of resources for those in the community. I would like the panelists, you know, we've talked about kind of the passage of the ordinance, the motivation behind the ordinance amendment. I want to shift to speaking about the significance of such a protection, and particularly, you know, in protecting individuals from housing discrimination based on their arrest or conviction record. If you want to speak to that. And also note, you know, what do you think would have happened if this ordinance amendment had never been passed and the impact on individuals?
That's a great question. I can actually start there. What I think would have happened is a person like myself, who did over a decade in prison, would have definitely ended back up in prison. It could have increased recidivism. A lot of people end up in domestic violence relationships because of not being unhoused or having to settle and just live wherever you have to live. As President Preckwinkle know, when I was advocating, and I met President Preckwinkle for the first time in person, I was living out of my car, out of my vehicle. So it was one of the darkest times in my life. You know, so, and I want to, the impact, I need to definitely highlight this, that the impact of an ordinance like this is not only the basic need part of it, the physical aspect of it, of being housed, but the narrative and also the impact that it has on a returning citizen's self-image and value. I go into the jails once a week speaking with the women, and a lot of us, we have a lack of value and purpose because we have an arrest or a conviction record. And the Just Housing Amendment, when I look in the mirror, I can see myself as not just a person with a record. Because of the Just Housing Amendment, I am not my record. And what it did was it affirmed people like me, because people that never been arrested or convicted actually advocated, fought, and had our backs. Whether it was legislators, whether it was advocates, community members, and it was a reflection to us and just that confirmation and affirmation that we are human too, and we should get another chance. And some of us, and I'm gonna cut this short, a lot of us, rather, many of us, we believe in these R words, I like to call it. Whether it's restoration, some of us rehabilitation, some of us, like myself, redemption. So you would think that this would be a natural, that we wouldn't get much pushback from an ordinance like this. Because all of us, every human being has made a mistake. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying everybody is guilty just because they've been arrested or convicted either. But every human being has made a mistake. And so to condemn, which means, condemn means to write off. Condemn means basically to throw in the garbage and say that this person, this soul, has no purpose, has no value. And so I just want to, coming from a person who has the arrest and conviction record, I just want to thank all of the advocates, community members, Cook County Commission. I just want to thank all of you for basically telling us, saying to us, you are not your record and you are not your mistake. If you made a mistake, it doesn't mean that you are a mistake. You don't have to be unhoused forever. You don't have to die homeless just because you've been incarcerated.
Yeah. Powerful. I would add two things. I think passage of the Just Housing Amendment had profound impact in two specific ways. One, it transformed the way we even talk about reentry and supporting people who are returning home from incarceration. And then the second thing that I did is it opened the door for us to have in Cook County, and I think because we were able to have it in Cook County, in other places as well, across the entire state and throughout the city of Chicago, about what it means to create real community safety outside of the scope of the criminal legal system. So I'll speak to the first point first. Reentry for a long time, basically since Reagan, had really been about getting people jobs, and if you got somebody a job, and they went through job training, they'd sort of be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and everything else would fall into place magically. It didn't quite acknowledge the fact that there were all sorts of barriers that people were facing to housing. It didn't acknowledge the fact that when you lock people out of basic needs and basic human needs, that people will frequently and often turn to things of desperation and will figure out a way to get things sometimes extra legal. And the passage of the ordinance really allowed for us to change the way we talk about reentry. So what we've seen is, I don't know how much this has gotten into the atmosphere, but I think later, either the next month, I think it was in the month of May, because the legislature had to adjourn. The state legislature amended the Illinois Human Rights Act and made it illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of an arrest record alone. That didn't happen until the Just Housing Amendment had been passed, and people had been working on that for years. And we also have seen a number of investments that have also flowed in terms of creating housing for folks with records as well, including within Cook County government led by President Preckwinkle, seeing more opportunities to demonstrate the efficacy of making sure that people have access to housing instead of being discriminated against. And then, lastly, I'd just say, it transformed the way we talk about public safety. For so long, it had the theory and the dominant narrative had always been lock them up and throw away the key, without acknowledging the fact that when you look at who experiences homelessness in the city of Chicago, you know, from 2000 to 2010, 2015, almost 80% of the adults who were unsheltered and homeless were people who had been incarcerated. You know, that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because we have a lot of barriers and obstacles that are in the way. But again, this amendment allowed for us to have a different conversation and to be able to support people in new ways.
Thank you all so much. I do want to note April 25th marks the passage of 6 years from the passage of the Just Housing Amendment. So I do want to speak to kind of what are some of the successes of the ordinance, or that you believe, and does it align with your initial vision or expectations?
Well, let me start. First of all, I just want to commend the folks to my right here. It was really their hard work with the realtors in hammering out an agreement, I think, that was foundational here. If we just try to sort of impose something on the real estate community, we would have had a lot of guerrilla actions, I think, afterwards. But because people were at the table, we were more likely to get compliance. So I just want to, and I wasn't part of that work, honestly, so I want to give credit to the people who did do the work. But I think having pretty broad support, not just from advocates, but from the real estate community when an agreement was finally hammered out, really helped us. This TransUnion collaboration, or whatever it is called. So small Cook County landlords could easily access the information that they needed. The staff at the county has done a lot of work trying to get information out to people about complying with the ordinance, including sending information out with property tax assessments. It's a good way to reach everybody. Okay. And then in 2023, the National Association of Counties, which is the national organization that counties belong to, called NACO, gave us an award for the work that was done by our Human Rights and Ethics Commission around outreach for this ordinance. So all those things I'm proud of.
Thank you.
I want to share a quick story. We have and this woman said I can say her name, Teresa Clay. She is one of our community navigators. And our community navigators, their role is to help implement the ordinance and educate on the ordinance and help referrals as well. And Teresa Clay, our navigators are directly impacted by incarceration and houselessness. And Teresa was one of our navigators that overcame being unhoused, who overcame so many things, so many obstacles and challenges in life. And today, she has gotten her record sealed, and she is housed. And there are so many others that I can actually give name to, people that I know. 90% of my Facebook friends have records. A great percentage of my contacts in my cell phone are people who have arrest and conviction records. And so I know the stories, and I know how the Just Housing Amendment has really, really impacted our individual lives, and of course, as a collective. I've been a part of different policies being passed throughout the years, throughout the decade. And this one, the Just Housing Amendment, it was revolutionary to me. It was historical because I actually see it transforming people's lives. As I spoke before, when it comes to domestic violence, I'm a real advocate when it comes to victims of domestic violence. And this has kept several women that I know from having to be in those type of situations, right? And losing their lives because this is where I have to live at. You know, there are so many stories that I could name. And as I said before, it just shows how much support that we have. And a lot of people, you know, like, they think that we don't, us that with arrest or conviction records, that we don't care about accountability. I'm like, that is so far off. But when we are sentenced, when we were sentenced, that was the accountability aspect. If we're talking about policy and legislation, if we're talking about, you know, doing time, that was the accountability, the parole, the probation, the whatever, that was it. You know, and so where is the mercy? I believe in a balance between accountability and mercy. When I go into jails, I talk about both. We have to, as a county, as a city, as a state, you know, we have to have that balance as human beings, to care about people's stories, to care about people for real, you know, and be able to have that empathy and be able to wear other people's shoes. Imagine what it's like, you know, to be in someone else's shoes, to be human. To me, this is not political. People laugh when I say that. It's not political to me. It's not about that to me, but it's about being a human. You know, it's one day we don't know. You may need mercy for something. You may need mercy. It's called mercy. You know, and so when I look at JHA, I see mercy. And look at me. People, one of the fears was that, oh, they're forcing landlords to rent out to people with records. Well, can I say to you, when I got my first apartment in Blue Island, I was so grateful. I was so grateful to be safe. Mm-hmm. To be safe, especially as a woman. My landlord told me, every year she would say, please, are you gonna leave? Can you please renew your lease? And I'm thinking in my head, lady, I've been in a cell. It's hard to get a place to stay. Like, I'm not going nowhere. I just be like, yeah. And let me tell y'all this real quick, this quick testimony, because right now I'm representing those with arrest and conviction records. And they say, we're gonna go back, once a criminal, always a criminal. I lived in that place for 6 or 7 years. My landlord cried when I left. But you know what? I transitioned to my own building. Now I'm a landlord in Cook County, in Chicago. So people can't say, especially with the support of our legislators in the community, what a person with a record can't do. And let me tell you all this right here. My former landlord called me to ask me to help her fill her units. And I was able to refer women and men that did time to her. So she trusted me, my word, and did not look at my background. And she made that money off of me, okay? She got paid, right? Okay. Sorry for being long with it, but I had to tell that testimony, okay?
That's right. I would just want to acknowledge a couple of people because I'm seeing these images. First, then Commissioner, now Mayor Brandon Johnson, who is a champion for this ordinance amendment. And, you know, Mayor Johnson, somebody who has a brother who has since passed away, but who had direct experience with homelessness, substance use. So he's talked about this on the public record, so I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. But it was an issue that was very passionate for him and personal for him, and I think we wouldn't have gotten far without him. I think it's also important to acknowledge and lift up the late Commissioner Dennis Deere, who at the time was actually chair of the Human Rights and Ethics Committee. and was an ally along the way as well. I know former Commissioner Suffredin, I think, played a critical role as well. And I'm sorry to name drop. I know that there are plenty of commissioners who voted for this and were helpful, but I just wanted to acknowledge some specific folks. And then also, I think Madam President Preckwinkle, who I think is being a little modest, partly because, Madam President, you've got a very, very strong team who I think understands where that you wanted to make sure we had a fair shot to work through the democratic process, as you said. And I would just say that I've been through a lot of efforts to try to move housing policy, and I think this one was the first one where it felt like we were actually able to have a conversation with the other side and be heard. And I think that only happens when there is someone, and I think there are a lot of things happening in the world that demonstrates this, but when there is someone who is making sure that we're calling fair balls and strikes, and creating an opportunity for us to at least have a conversation and for the issue to be taken very seriously. And so I think we'd be remiss if we didn't thank you, of course, in addition to all the other advocates and stakeholders, for giving us a fair shot to even begin to work through the democratic process to make this happen. So just wanted to make sure that we acknowledged you and gave you your flowers for that as well. And I think it's also important to say that it's important to note that the ordinance is working. Some people may look at the reports that come out on an annual basis and wonder why, some may be under the notion or belief that there should be more people who are filing complaints. And I think it frequently starts out such that people will file complaints, but what people should also know is that in Cook County, we have a very strong human rights ordinance that has real teeth to it. Which is not the case in a lot of other places and a lot of other jurisdictions, which sometimes means and frequently means that a lot of times people are able to obtain a remedy to housing discrimination through settlements because going through the investigation process presents a challenge. And so I think that the county deserves a lot of credit and all our leadership deserves appreciation for the way in which this has been implemented effectively. And frankly, for the design of our human rights ordinance as well, such that it's been able to work for countless people. So just wanted to lift those things up.
Well said.
Thank you all so much. I just want to acknowledge that you all sharing this has really brought forth the true impact of the JHA, and also not just, of course, the impact on individuals' lives, but how when our community leaders and our county leaders work together to create something like this, it can have such a great impact. So I do thank you all for your work. And for the final question of the panel, as we've talked about how this came about, the drafting of the ordinance amendment and some of the successes, what is one thing you hope will be accomplished through the JHA that has not yet been realized? And I want to start with Madam President, but I want to add a slight adjustment to the question, because Madam President, you spoke about how the JHA is a part of a larger effort to reform the criminal justice system. So if you can speak maybe more broadly about one thing you hope that will be accomplished or realized through the work at the county.
I'm tempted to ask you to answer the question.
If you want.
Yeah, why don't you take a stab at it first?
Perfect.
You're actually doing the day-to-day work,
That's true, that's true. I will say there's a lot of work through the leadership of Madam President across the county in equity generally, and in particularly in criminal justice reform, where we've seen, of course, in relation to the Pretrial Fairness Act, as well as even, I think we talk about JHA, but also in terms of resources for individuals, the basic income program that's very important, and I hope to see even more municipalities across the country model this. But really seeing more connection even of, I know a lot of us are doing so much work and we're having more collaboration across the county. And so continuing to do that and build on the work that we are currently doing. And I look forward to kind of what fruit that will bear as we continue to do this work here, certainly under the leadership of Madam President.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer.
Thank
So,
you.
I'm not gonna answer the question. What concerns me at this moment, both nationally and locally, is that after, I feel, a while here, we've been moving toward criminal justice reform and more initiatives around the country focused on inequities in our criminal justice system. Now we have a leader in the federal government who is clearly of the, lock them up and throw away the key. Isn't that what you said? Lock them up and throw away the key mentality. And it's hard to know how that's going to impact our criminal justice work here locally and nationally. I'm also concerned about the person who we've elected to be state's attorney in Cook County. I don't think she surely doesn't share my views of the criminal justice system and the need for criminal justice reform. So talking out of school a little bit. I have both national and local concerns about where we are in criminal justice reform. We're gonna continue to do what we do and operate from our values, but the environment, I think, is more challenging, surely at the local and at the federal level, to do the work we've been doing.
Thank you.
Here, there's a lot that really resonates with me in that, President Preckwinkle. Yeah, I would say that we look forward to supporting the implementation work and continuing to raise awareness about the resources. With an ordinance like this and protections like these, it's important to bear in mind that there are constantly people, unfortunately, who are still cycling in and out of incarceration, and sometimes people for the first time. And so we have to continue to educate people about the rights that they have. This is the work that Maria was speaking about with her team and her colleagues who are doing navigation and training work. And so, we certainly look forward to that. I'm really excited about the increased capacity within your department to continue monitoring implementation, supporting the enforcement of the ordinance as well. It's really important that when we have these types of ordinances in place and protections in place, that we not only have the letter of the law, but that we have the capacity to be able to implement effectively. And so just really look forward to continuing to support all of that work that's been happening. And again, you all deserve so much credit for all of the work that's gone into implementation.
I would say, so one thing that we have to note is that there are so many people that's still incarcerated, that's doing 30, 40, 50 years. So implementation and education, we have to have the capacity to continue to do this work. Because as I said, when I go into jails, the women and men in the jails they're not aware of it because they've been there 3, 4 years fighting their, cases and so forth. And people come out of prison and they don't know about the ordinance. So definitely to expand on education inside of the institutions, and then, initial reentry as well. And then simply for me, what my heart is that to continue to see individual lives change. And those with arrest and conviction, saying to themselves and to each other, look, we have all of these folks fighting with us, standing with us, saying that we are human and we have value and we have purpose. That's my message right there. And so we have to see ourselves that way. So I want to see a decrease in suicide, a decrease. Sometimes we like, what does this have to do? It's a connection. To be unhoused, to not be able to, get your basic needs met. It leads to so many other, it takes you down a whole rabbit hole. Right? But it does affect how you see yourself. And so I just want to see individual lives change and for them to know that, as a matter of fact, if you're looking at this and you have an arrest or conviction record, you are valuable, you are important, you are loved, you are needed, and you have a purpose. And it's not over. You haven't messed up too much. It's not too late.
Thank you all so much. This has been a really great conversation. I do, it's 10:56. I want to make sure that we end on time. I know you all have a lot to do. I do want to take one question from the audience, and that will be our final question for this panel. How will Cook County continue to both advocate and protect those with arrest records under the Trump administration? How will we truly take care of the most vulnerable or the protected class? I'm sorry. Do you want me? I can read it. How will Cook County continue to both advocate and protect those with arrest records under the Trump administration? And how will we truly take care of this most vulnerable protected class?
My basic view of Trump is that he's trying to overwhelm and demoralize us with all these executive orders and actions. It's not just about immigration, it's not just about health care, it's not just about civil rights, it's sort of about everything at once, everything, everywhere, all at once. And what I say to people is, you have to think of this as a skirmish line, and you figure out where you are in the skirmish line and fight there, and you have to count on other people to fight in other places, right? Because you can't fight everywhere, you yourself. So pick where you're going to be on the line and focus there, right? And we're going to be on the skirmish line around healthcare, because 60% of our budget is healthcare, and if they make tremendous cuts in Medicaid, it'll be devastating to our healthcare system, and that's what they're contemplating. We're on the immigration part of the skirmish line because the federal government is suing us personally. The governor and the state chief of police, me and the sheriff, and the mayor and the superintendent of police are named in a suit by the Department of Justice claiming that we're not enforcing immigration law. Now, our view is that it's the federal government's responsibility to enforce immigration statutes, not the state and the county and the city. So we're going to be in a legal battle, which my counsel tells me is a year and a half, probably, before there's an adjudication here. It'll probably go to the Supreme Court. So we definitely are in the healthcare part of the battle, and we're in the immigration part of the battle. And we're surely, because of our criminal justice work, going to be on the skirmish line around assaults on our efforts to pursue criminal justice reform and on people who have been justice involved. Now, what form their attacks are going to take, I mean, my view is they're coming after everybody. I shouldn't laugh, right? Pardon me?
Deporting U.S. citizens?
Yeah, they're snatching people off our streets who are United States citizens and sending them to El Salvadorian prisons. I mean,
No due process.
and no due process for anybody. I mean, let alone, it seems to me if you're in this country, you're entitled to due process, whether you're a citizen or not, right? And so, but that's not the position that this president has taken. They're snatching people up off our streets and sending them to hellholes in El Salvador. Okay. All right. So, pardon me.
The citizens.
Yeah, well, they shouldn't do this to anybody who's on our soil, but they surely shouldn't be doing it to citizens. But anyway, and his view apparently is anybody who's convicted of a crime in this country should be shipped, has the possibility of being shipped to a prison in El Salvador, convicted of committing a crime. So we will be in that battle as well, although that battle is coming. We're already here around healthcare and immigration, but they're gonna try to marginalize as many different categories of Americans as they possibly can, and surely those who have been justice involved are a category that they'll target. So what I say to people is, just think of yourself as part of the resistance, and what do you have to do as part of the resistance?
Thank you so much, Madam President. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, Madam President Amadou Dramé, and Maria Moon. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing not only your experiences, your experience with drafting this ordinance, the motivation behind it, but also the personal stories, which I think really show us the true impact and give a lot of color to how this truly came about. I do want to thank you all for joining us this morning as well. I hope that you take from this something, whether it's learning more about how this ordinance came to be or how it's truly impacting individuals on an everyday basis. I do want to know it's certainly a part of a broader array of equity work being done by the county, and I'm certainly proud to be a part of it. As our chair noted, if you yourself have experienced discrimination or you know someone who has, please contact the Cook County Commission on Human Rights. As we depart, please enjoy the slideshow, which shares a little bit more about the history of the passage of the JHA. Please join me again in thanking our panelists for joining us, and also I want to thank Commissioner Aguilar for joining us too in person. Also, feel free, we have